Hello, and welcome to another of my series in conversation with. And today I have with me journalist John Waters. Some of you will be familiar with him already, and maybe people who are a lot younger than me, maybe not so much, and people living outside of Ireland, maybe not so much. But he's certainly a very well-known figure um, in Ireland generally. So anyway, I'm going to pass you over to him to give a brief introduction about who he is and what he's done up to now in his life and career, and then we can discuss um, various subjects, including what he's doing at the moment. Okay, John, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Luke. I used to be a journalist. I don't really think of myself as a journalist anymore because I think the profession of journalism is somewhat discredited now for reasons that we might go into later. But I was in journalism, in mainstream journalism for 30 odd years. I started off in a music magazine, Hot Press, rock and roll. And I was then one of the other magazines in Dublin was one, a listings magazine, which did a lot of political stuff, and Miguel, which was a very interesting kind of unique publication in Ireland, which is a very kind of a spectator, but much more in depth, I think. I was editor of those publications for periods, and then eventually I ended up in the Irish Times, where I was a columnist for 24 years. Weekly columnist, I did all kinds of political, social, cultural, spiritual, whatever stuff. And in that period, I wrote 10 books as well. I about different things there again, politics, spiritual issues, cultural, whatever. And then about 10 years ago, I ran afoul of particular people, and they came after me when I was in the Irish Times. And what happened then was that my so-called colleagues in the Irish Times started to gang up on me, and some of them anonymously on Twitter. But I did a little investigating and found them, caught them red-handed, and I asked the editor to sort it out, and he refused to even speak to me. So I left the paper after 24 years, and I kind of hung around the mainstream. That was a mistake, I think, for about a year. I went into a different newspaper, The Independent. I didn't like it, and a year later I quit that completely. So that's nearly 10 years ago now, and since then I wrote for American magazines and international magazines for a few years, and then I started my Substack after in 2020, in about 4 years ago, more or less exactly, and I've been doing that now for the last 4 years. And in fact, it's actually, to be honest with you, Luke, it's the most satisfying work I've ever done, writing. Aside from my books, because more and more I was finding journalism really unsatisfactory, because one of the things I noticed about them was that they were constantly pushing you into narrower and tighter corners. I started off in the Irish Times as a column which was kind of flexible. It was up at the top of the page. You could write up to, I figured out, up to 2,500 words, which is a considerable length of space in a newspaper in a daily, that isn't a weekend supplement or something. And but then gradually they put me over on the side, and it was double column first, it was about 1,200 words, and then they reduced it to one wider column, which brought it down to about 1,000 words, and then they started putting things underneath it, like corrections and clarifications and all this nonsense. And in the end, it was actually 840 words. And as I've said many times, if I did 841 words, they would take out one word, and it would most likely be the most vital word in the whole column. So that was not, I think, an accidental thing. I think that was a deliberate strategy, not just against me, of course, against the entire idea of communicating complex thoughts and ideas in a newspaper, which used to be what they were for, but it ceased to be what they were for, I would say, about 15 years ago. And it became really just kind of, Twitter before Twitter,
Yeah, that does sound very deliberate. I worked in publishing a long time myself. I started out in pretty crappy financial magazine company. And I did a little bit of journalism myself. Back then, it was just freelance. I got paid, I think, £250 per 1,000 words. And I noticed over time, as I continued writing articles here and there, there's no money. If you're freelance, it's very hard to get paid. And I think one of the problems that journalism has suffered from is because as the jobs become more and more sought after, and there's less and less paid jobs in journalism, people are not prepared to take any risks. So if the editor says jump, your answer is, how high would you like me to jump? Not,
Yeah.
this is a really important piece. This is absolutely vital that this is put out into the mainstream, etc. People don't know balls anymore because they're terrified of losing their job, and they know getting another paid position as a journalist is going to be incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think another factor that's really damaged journalism in the last couple of decades is the convergence of the idea of recruiting journalists from universities and from journalism colleges, which used not to be the way. I mean, the main inlet, as it were, for journalists into the mainstream international newspapers one time was via provincial newspapers, local newspapers, where you kind of people cut their teeth, in the court circuit, doing the local district courts and so on, and reporting on various political events and council meetings and all that kind of stuff. And the result was not so much that, that's a very rudimentary training, but the point was that you attracted in a different variety, quite a variety of different kinds of people. Whereas the modern way of doing it, the recent way of doing it, tends to make everybody more or less the same. And they go through this kind of grinder, which reduces any kind of originality seems to disappear from them. And by the time they come out, they're producing just standard kind of prototype articles. I found that as an editor, they started to appear and there was no flair, there was no imagination, there was no kind of, that was an interesting thing. Like, for example, we had gone through at that time back in it was the 80s when I was really editing publications, and that was kind of after the whole new journalism revolution with Tom Wolfe and so on, and Hunter S. Thompson, those guys who are basically kind of method journalists, really, out there, engaging with reality and writing subjectively about what happened. That's an extreme version of what journalism might be, and using novelistic techniques and so on and so on. But, the other form, what actually happened to mainstream journalism went completely in the other direction, where it was just simply kind of like formulaic articles written with kind of, boilerplate kind of sentences and so on. And it just became lacking. It just lacked any imagination. So when eventually the internet came along, the mainstream media was an easy target. It was very easy to take out because it wasn't very interesting. There was no real, or very little, let's say, not all. There were some good writers who managed to find their way through, but it was quite unusual. And in fact, they weren't really respected. Good writers ceased to be respected in newspapers. I found that. I remember one time, having a conversation with my op-ed editor. He was the guy on the page who managed the page that I was writing for. I was having a conversation with him about, what I was doing, and I happened to just slip in a sentence into what I said about, and I used the word writing, and he said, journalism is the processing of information, nothing else.
That's interesting. That's very, very true to now. I think, you're probably aware that the major news sources are Reuters and Associated Press. And I've noticed that so much of what you see on the regular news outlets is just cut and paste job with a few words moved around. That's basically it. They're not actually writing anymore.
Yeah, and that's deliberate because that kind of has a kind of a yellow pack benefit. That can go out and be used anywhere. You can just change the label and it becomes, the property of whatever newspaper, and they can put, they put on some byline on it. It doesn't really matter. It's the same thing appears in every newspaper right around the globe. And that's, of course, a way of homogenizing not just journalism, but homogenizing the public view of what's important in the world and how those important issues are to be properly regarded, what the correct view of those issues is. So all of these things have to do quite sinister, if that's not too strong a word, but I don't think it is, because we're talking here about the channel by which most people glean their information, the media, obviously. And it's very important, that people understand in supposedly democratic societies what actually are the events, what do they mean approximately, and what are the different views about them that are out there, and can we hear all that? And of course, we don't hear all that anymore at all. And that all comes down to numerous factors, some of which we've touched on. And I think a very important one is also that, in the context of those journalism colleges, there is very much something that you can detect in those the products of those colleges is an ideological tilting on across a range of issues. Liberal, what we would now call woke, all that kind of stuff. Was fed through those channels, and is very much part of what that whole process was about. I mean, you go back 40 years, there were all kinds of different journalists, all kinds of strange people. Like, remember in Ireland, we had like Con Houlihan, who wrote about sport and wrote about literature in the evening press, and he was a big mountain man from Kerry who, basically he was brilliant, genius. But he wasn't educated in the formal sense. He was just a brilliant writer and a brilliant thinker. And it would be impossible for somebody like him to break into journalism as it is now. And indeed, he wouldn't want to.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few others. There was his name now. Is it Finton? He died not that long ago. I'm trying to think of his name now. Yeah, I used to watch quite a lot of his reportage, and he'd been very much marginalized.
Yes, I know who you mean. I don't remember his second name. I remember I saw his videos very, very often, actually. He was really good,
There is I want you to quickly go back. You mentioned Grinder. I refer to that as the sausage machine. And I think that's very much a process of taking all, not just journalism, but all of sort of human life, human functionality, and shoving it through this grinder, this sausage machine, a homogenization of the human being. Because it makes life easier for I suppose what you want to call them, the controllers, if you like, or whatever terminology you think is appropriate. But the basic fact is that they want to make us as manageable as possible. I think Ivor Cummings uses the term ant farm a lot, but it's basically different versions of the same idea.
Yes.
That we're just being corralled into the most convenient and easiest route to make us manageable and controllable.
Well, I think the technological revolution, it now appears, has made that possible. Now, most human beings thinking about the usage you might make of technology, that would not be among the first 10 million that they would come up with, controlling the entire human race. But inevitably, there are people who want to do things like that. And the technological revolution has made that possible. So in a certain sense, this has to do with, as it were, progress. That unfortunately, these technologies now become available for surveillance and control of different money and identity and so on. And they're trying to weaponize all of this now to basically create a digital prison. And that's kind of something that crept up on us. It's very interesting, though. I've been writing quite a lot about this subject in my Substack, it seems to me something really interesting happened in the last 40 years in this context. That if you go back 40 years, when I was an editor in Dublin magazine and later in McGill, as I mentioned earlier, at that moment, mid-80s, there was a lot of material coming out in journalism, by good people, by good writers and so on, about the future of work, the future of human participation in society, the future of the human, how would humanity look in 50 years under the attrition of technology? Would we be working? Would we be sort of lolling around the house and, wondering what to do with our time? How would we spend our time? How would we distribute income? Would we? And so on. And it was very interesting that there was an explosion of that kind of material in the mid-'80s. I remember carrying articles in different publications I was editing and talking to various experts or people who had experience, like psychiatrists or whatever, watching on these issues, who had views on these issues. And that then, you would have expected that would have escalated through the 90s and into the new millennium, but it actually ceased.
Yeah,
and it ceased for a very interesting reason, which was that the world basically got rich, or imagined that it was getting richer, because you had these in the wake of the Reagan, era. You had a boom in America, which then spread to Europe, and by the 90s it arrived in Ireland. The Celtic Tiger, the late 90s.
It was really credit, though. It wasn't real richness. In fact, it was really availing of easy credit was. That's
right. That's right. And property prices, manipulation of property prices, and all of that. And also there was a very interesting factor of it as well, low interest rates, which, created the illusion for people that because they could access money through loans, they thought they felt richer because they would buy a car or whatever. But in actual fact, while that was all happening, their incomes from their work was actually more or less plateauing in real terms. And there was no progress being made in that context at all. But people didn't notice that because they felt richer. And the other thing was that while all of this was happening, was that the whole concept of everything to do with technology in this broader context, what we now think of as the technological revolution, whether it's the internet, whether it's computers, whether it's AI, all these things that have erupted really in the last decade now very forcibly, or particularly in the last decade, that they kind of went off the radar. And essentially, my view is that what happened was that the guys who wanted control of this took away, started to develop all of these technologies. And then while everybody else was distracted with prosperity, with, their various tigers, and then about 7, 8, 9 years ago, they came back to the table and said, okay, now we're all set to go. We've got it all worked out. We're in charge. It's all, the technology belongs to us. We've sussed all that out. And you just sit up and listen up. Okay? That's the deal. And that's basically what's happened in the world. And the entire democratic process has basically been bypassed.
Yeah.
Something which should be fundamental to the future of the human race, i.e. control of the mechanisms whereby, pretty much everything could be generated in the future. I mean, in terms of economics, in terms of communications, in terms of, work, in terms of all of those things, that has been taken over. And indeed, we now know that there is much more coming as well in terms of the transhumanist aspect of it. And indeed, the general, the whole AI thing, which is momentous in its implication. And this has been allowed to bypass democracy. And even now, nobody's saying it.
Well, that worries me a great deal. And one of the things I've come to realize is that the EU is totally undemocratic. I had trouble to try and re-find this interview, or rather it was a documentary by a Swedish investigative journalist about the EU and about how it operates, and he particularly looked into the European Commission. The ideas go to the EU Parliament through the Commission, but he was looking at where does the European Commission get its ideas and agenda from? And that's when he started to uncover all the lobbying, all the corporate interests. And, you mentioned in your book, Give Us Back the Roads. Give Us Back the Bad Roads, that whole plan for Europe was all generated by Ford and Volvo, and they put together a huge bunch of proposals which went through the European Commission and then was rubber stamped by the Parliament. No say at any point of the electorate in this process. And he said this is just one issue. He said you go through hundreds and hundreds of EU issues which are like that, where it's a corporate agenda that's fed through the
Yeah, that's right.
The commission through lobbying, and we don't know anything about it. He says it's one of the most undemocratic organizations in the world, but it masquerades as a democratic sort of superstate.
Yeah, it's very interesting you see that, because I mean, my father was very much opposed to the EU. One of just the many, well, not a huge number, but there was a lot of people, a significant minority way back, who were always consistently against it, and he was one of them. And so I used to hear him talk about it a lot, and you know, even at a time when I wasn't really tuned into what was going on. But subsequently, I myself became very much opposed to it. And back in the early 90s, I remember the Maastricht Treaty, which was really a critical juncture when the whole thing was kind of like ramped up exponentially. I opposed the referendum that happened then, and I was on the road with a man called Raymond Crotty, whom some people will remember, older people, but he was a brilliant advocate of independence and autonomy for Ireland and sovereignty and all those things. And so, I was always involved in that. And I went to the Irish Times in 1990, and I started to write immediately in that way about it, and I wrote a lot of stuff. And, incurred huge displeasure from the management and editors and so on for doing so. I remember actually one day, this remark was kind of jocosely made somewhat, but there was a barb at the back of it. He said, I'd written some particular thing about the EU, and I used to call them Eurobullies, because that was kind of the whole vibe about it, was you do what we say and you just shut up and listen. But he came up to me and said, we used to have corporal punishment around here for people like you. And he kind of said it in a way that was ambiguous. I mean, there was a sense in which he meant it. And it was almost like an aspiration being expressed. I wish we could just hammer you, and they were really disgusted. And I mean, I used to get notes from editors when I would send in anything about the EU. They would send me back these kind of snide notes, sneering and so on. So there was a huge clamoring for this whole thing. And, it always struck me as very interesting when you actually, very often, Luke, there's a kind of a truth that you can divine almost literally by just kind of reflecting on reality and things that are being said, but also things that are not being said, and the general atmosphere that you're picking up. And I remember actually many times thinking about the idea of the MEP, whom we would elect every 4 years and send off to Brussels or to Strasbourg. And then, 6 months later, you'd say, oh, I wonder what happened to him.
Yeah, no, you never hear a word about.
Never. And you'd almost get the point that after 2.5 years, it would feel as if he was dead. I haven't seen that guy for ages. Did anything happen to him? Did he get run over by a car or something? And then, another 18 months down the road, he would be back wanting to be re-elected.
Looking for votes, kissing the babies again, yeah.
That seemed always to me to be emblematic of something, that the parliamentary aspect of the EU was there for show, and not much show even at that. And that what was really important was the Commission and all that other stuff that was going on, which of course is what we know is to be the case. And essentially what has happened to the EU, and I ran for the European Parliament this year in Midlands Northwest. And that was one of the points that I made any time I got to make any point, which wasn't that often, to be honest, because that's another story. But in public debates, I mean. That the EU had become a totalitarian operation, and that it was basically running our countries without any consideration, not just of the democratic process allegedly happening within the European Union itself, but the democratic processes of each individual member country were being ignored. And basically, tablets of stone were being handed down to the leaders, so-called, of those countries, and that is something I have long since felt that should be really alerted. The public should be alerted. But going back to the problem, the media was rigged on that issue from the very start.
Yeah. totally complicit. But
Yeah.
one thing I've occurred to me is sort of somewhat of an irony about this amazing embrace of the EU as the savior of Ireland and all things Irish. Um, I mean, looking at the context of the history, the long struggle of Ireland to gain its own independence. Um, Historically, there would have been alliances with France, with Spain, with Scotland, even anybody in Europe who wasn't England, basically, would be there'd be overtures for help. So I'm wondering if that historical context has got something to do with why people embrace the EU so readily and are not prepared to look at its flaws in any way. They just think, well, it's better to be like have a European master than to have a British Empire master. But ultimately, I think that there's very little difference between the dictates of the EU and the dictates of the former British Empire. Ultimately, we lose our sovereignty, and we have no say, and you
Yeah.
just have a leader that rubber stamps everything comes
That's
down to
exactly
one
right.
line.
That's exactly right. And I think, you can almost detect, I think you can detect actually in Irish history or in Irish pathology or psychology, this kind of almost sense desperate looking around for a new oppressor, that a few decades after we've shaken off the British Empire, we're looking for another empire to bow down before. And there's an element of truth in that, I think. But this is like something which again goes back to this Pavlovian thing. I think you mentioned something like this there a short time ago. That all of these things are insinuated to people. That there are certain tropes that are put out there. Oh, if you're not in favor of the EU, you're somehow like a Neanderthal. I mean, this conflation of Europe with the EU as if the two things were synonymous, which of course they're not at all. Europe is a continent of multiplicity of different countries and nationalities and cultures. The EU is just a monolithic bureaucracy which is put down to suppress all that. But that was a thing, and I mean, it's all about, of course, about money as well. I remember back in I forget what year it was, sometime it was 92 actually, yes, in the Maastricht debate. I was debating with Albert Reynolds, who was at the time, I think he was Taoiseach actually at the time, and he actually said at one point, well, he says, John, have you got £7 billion to give me if we don't vote yes to Maastricht? And I said, well, not right on me at the moment, Taoiseach, but that was the mentality, and that really fed into people's sense of what was real. It's very much like what happened to the Irish language. The insinuation that the language was to do with backwardness. Convince people, even against their own affections, that they should actually go against their own language. And in the same way, this idea that the EU somehow represented modernity and progress and civilization and these things, which of course it doesn't in the least, was convincing for people. And they looked down on people who, that was in a way, one of the reasons I used that term, or give us back the bad roads, was because, and it wasn't specifically about that, it's a much broader concept in the book, but in that particular context, I was continually running into people and when I would be in an argument, and I would go back and forward, and I mean, I would win those arguments up to a point, but then the killer punch always was, well, they give us the roads, where would we be without the roads, And I says, well, we do just fine. I drove around on roads for years around the west of Ireland before we had motorways, and they were grand. We got by, and some of them are still there, by the way, and they're still working. People still drive on them. So.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you about your involvement in COVID awareness, or in terms of changing people's perception and sort of I suppose a sort of almost like blanket ban on any alternative view on what happened there and why it happened.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly right. I mean, I've been writing a lot about that and talking a lot about that for the last 4.5 years, I guess. But back in April of 2020, myself and another former mainstream journalist, Jim O'Doherty, decided to take a constitutional action against the government about the lockdown, challenging the lockdowns. And that was kind of something which, really set the scene for the following years in lots of different ways for me personally. But it eventually was unsuccessful. We didn't even get the right to actually put forward our judicial review proceedings. That went on for over 2 years. But I remember at that time, and I was talking to a guy the other day, and he's the first person that I met who actually agreed with me when I suggested the following, or said this following, that actually when I think of those, do you remember those April and May days, which are beautiful sunny days? And I think of those now, and I look, and then they make me retch. There's something about them that was absolutely nausea-making, that the whole atmosphere is so toxic, which had been generated by this corrupt government and indeed corrupt establishment in the world, a particular establishment. And so at that time we decided, I thought actually, on the basis of my gut instinct and living in Ireland for so long and all my life and listening to liberals and listening to kind of libertarians and listening to all civil libertarians, etc., that, okay, we would put together some kind of a proposal to challenge the thing. But, by the time we got to the forecourts, to submit these proceedings, I imagined that the place would already be full up of, former attorneys general, former justice ministers, former judges, former lawyers, civil libertarians, bishops, canons, all of these people who believe in freedom and justice and truth and decency and all these things. And I thought, so we put together this, case, but it'll really be only a formality because, there'll be so many others that will get lost in the thicket. We were the only people who seemed to have thought of a challenge. And that started this kind of sort of adventure then. I mean, we came under a huge attack from the media. Obviously, they were set on us like wild dogs, twisting everything. Of course, not reporting anything about what was in our proceeding, our pleadings or anything like that. And so this went on for over 2 years. And I mean, for quite a long time, actually, I literally couldn't walk down the street where I lived in Dublin, because of the abuse I was getting, particularly from males on bicycles, because they put a new cycle lane just outside our place, where we live. And it was like a racetrack, like these guys would be zooming along and they would slow down marginally, and just to let fly with their payload of abuse, and then they would speed up and off they would go. I mean, it is whatever it was. But again, Pavlovian, they were programmed to do that by, RTE, by the Irish Times and so on. And so it just seems, and today I look at it, it boggles my mind. I say to myself, did this actually happen? Did it actually happen that the Irish government, on the basis of a rumour about some kind of respiratory illness, which was untested, unverified, closed down the country, locked people more or less in their homes, forbade them from going any more than 2 kilometres away from their home, made them stand apart 6 foot apart, not visit their elderly relations, leave their elderly relations, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers, to die alone in nursing homes or hospitals, rather than actually go in and wish them, God bless, or whatever they would want to wish them. And that the entire establishment of Ireland backed this, including the churches, including the civil libertarians. I mean, this seems to me an abomination beyond imagination. I cannot to this day believe that it even happened. Sometimes I think it's a nightmare and I'm going to wake up and I'm going to think, of course it didn't happen.
Yeah, it did quite shock me, people who I would have expected to be against all this, people who would in general be somewhat libertarian, free-thinking type people, suddenly they were just swept away in this sort of tidal wave of emotion and compliance. And I think at the root of it, there was an awful amount of emotional manipulation in various countries, not just here, that succeeded in convincing rational people to basically allow the fox to guard the henhouse.
I think as well, Luke, that there was another. This had only occurred to me recently in this form, that there were other dimensions, but one of them I think was this: that there was some kind of, as it were, secret communication that went down certain channels to be picked up by certain people, particularly journalists, maybe lawyers, etc., which conveyed something like, listen, don't think this is a normal event. Don't just look at this on its face value. This is really serious. We're doing this and we're not going to stop. We don't mean it's serious in gravity of the virus, but we mean that we are going through with this. So don't get in our way if you want to be part of our system in the future. I believe that something like that was communicated in some kind of abstruse or arcane way that we wouldn't necessarily know about, not being in those channels. And because that would kind of help to explain the unanimity of those sectors, which you wouldn't have expected, Luke. You know what I mean? You know, like in my life in journalism, like there were always mavericks, there were always dissidents, there were always people who were contrary about things. And no matter what it was, somebody at the meeting, the conference, whatever they would call it, you know, features conference, the news conference, some awkward guy at the back would make some kind of intervention and shift the ground altogether just before the end of the meeting. You know, that kind of thing would happen. And those guys just didn't appear. Yeah. Now, it may be to some extent because of what we talked about earlier, which was the unanimity, the homogeneity of journalism. That was certainly a factor in that. But there was something else. When you actually look, and I won't mention names here, but, you know, you take, say, let's just take a paragon of sort of, you know, exemplary liberal views, who has been, you know, highly respected, perhaps the kind of stature morally and so on as, you know, an archbishop in the old days, you know, that kind of level, maybe a journalist with a leading newspaper, say. And he's on board with this, and he's attacking people who refuse to take an untested injection. And he's sneering at people, and he's attacking and demonizing anybody who dissents from this. And he's doing it, you know, whether he's aware of it or not, he's actually, every time he opens his mouth or he turns on his computer, he contradicts everything he has stood for the previous 30 years.
Yeah.
And he doesn't seem to notice or care.
It's incredible. I think there's a term that maybe be appropriate, cognitive dissonance, when you look at the way that people go against their former behavior, their former thinking. It's as if their brain somehow became broken and they were no longer able to sort of function in a competent way.
Yes.
Maybe that's the case, or maybe, as you say, they were said, right, no more snout in the trough for you if you don't comply. Maybe it's as cynical as that they just were threatened in terms of their future income and viability, their careers, and that's why they went along with all this.
And that threat would also need to be accompanied by another further threat, which was that if they opened their mouths about the first threat, that would be tantamount to the same thing as going against the narrative. And they would suffer the same consequences. I think because it was completely hermetically sealed, the whole thing. And I don't think that the fear quotient alone would have been sufficient to maintain that the fear of any virus or whatever, within those certain sectors, you know, because those guys, you know, lawyers, journalists, they're trained to pick out details, to go after flaws in arguments, to ask questions. You know, that's their jobs.
You know, it's a dereliction of duty, really, when you think about it now.
Yes. Definitely.
Moving on a little bit from where we've been, we can see what a absolute disaster that was and what a disgrace it was in terms of, you would have thought referring to, the emperor's new clothes, there would have been at least one or two little boys along the side of the road pointing a finger at the naked emperor. But that failed to happen, and it was left to sort of people on the margins really to highlight this. Oh, I suppose they did crucify a few doctors like Robert Malone and various others.
Mm.
And now you have people like Dr. John Campbell, who was initially very pro the vaccine. He did a complete 360 based entirely on evidence. And that's from the start. He said he was interested in actual empirical evidence and not supposition and opinions. And that's exactly why he has made a 360, because the actual medical evidence now suggests that all those people that were cautious, that were not prepared to take an experimental vaccine, were right in the first place.
Yes.
But this evidence is still very, very, very slowly being released into the public arena, dribs and drabs, so that we won't all suddenly go, "Oh my gosh, look at this."
Yes, but there's an additional difficulty there as well, Luke, which is the corruption of the media again. And I mean this in a precise context, that something has dropped out of the mechanism whereby the public receive information via the media, to the extent that even when the media is actually reporting something in some form, it's not penetrating to the consciousness of the people. I mean, it's not that they are particularly, but even when there's a sense in which, for example, if you look at what's happened in the last few years in relation to excess deaths in Ireland, I mean, we've seen that in 3 years, 21, 22 and 23 and the present year, there's in the region of an additional 16, 17, 18% increase in excess deaths, which is, completely out of the spectrum of probability in relation to fluctuation, way multiples, way beyond orders of magnitude, way beyond what might occur there by reason of a normal kind of fluctuation or even an abnormal fluctuation. And so, we're talking about 20,000 people over the course of that. I don't necessarily mean that they're the excess deaths. Now, the point was that, the whole mission of the lockdown was to stop people dying. And, you might well say, well, that was very successful because almost nobody died in 2020. There were no excess deaths that year at all. So, but then there were excess deaths. And what happened in those 3 years? The media closed down and stopped wanting to talk about saving lives. So, it's monstrous. But then there was this bizarre episode. I remember this really strongly. There were 2 episodes, I think one in January, one in somewhat later in the year, from the Taoiseach Varadkar. And he said, first of all, that his most extraordinary statement in the Dáil, where in January 2023, where he said that, yes, there were excess deaths. And, but he says, then without actually dealing with the thing that was on the lips of many people by then, which was, these are the injections. This is the cause of it. He simply said, no, this is because of, the lockdown and, social distancing and the measures that we took and so on. And the starting thing was that this was presented as like an explanation and an excuse, as though the lockdown had descended from heaven. And I wished I'd been there in the Dáil that day to say, excuse me, Taoiseach, you've just confessed to being culpable in the deaths of tens of thousands of people. Can you clarify this? Are you admitting now what you denied at the beginning, that this has caused lives, far more lives than were caused by anything remotely resembling a virus? And you're now conceding by way of an excuse, by way of trying to obfuscate the issue, of course. You want to deny the more obvious factor, or the larger factor by far, more than likely, which is the injections. And the point about it was that nobody raised this. Like, this is pure common sense, Luke. You know what I mean? And
totally.
in the old world, this would have been all over the Liveline and the Prime Time and all these shows for the next week. This would have been, and he would be gone. Radker would have been gone as Taoiseach by Sunday.
But people don't resign anymore. They're utterly shamed.
Well, leaving that aside, they don't have to resign.
No.
When you remove that principle, which was articulated by Alistair Campbell way back when he was working for Tony Blair as his PR guy or a press guy, and he said something to the effect that, a politician who's in trouble in the media, if he can't get it off the front pages by the weekend, he's toast, right? That means there are consequences which flow. There were in the old, where media were watchdogs on democracy. Consequences would flow, and they were predictable. That was what people in bars used to sit around talking about. Oh no, he'll be gone by Sunday. I'm telling you now, he'll be gone. That's no longer holds. You can no longer say that about anything. No matter what the crime a politician is accused of virtually now, you cannot necessarily predict that it will mean that he'll have to leave his job at any particular point in the future.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That expectation seems to have somehow dissolved. It is quite incredible how...
it's an absence of prosecution, Luke,
Yeah.
Like, journalists are effectively political prosecutors. That's what they do. I mean, I remember actually when I was a journalist, like great editors like Vincent Brown and, those guys, they used to take glee out of the idea of bringing down the government. That was the kind of the gag,
People were terrified of Vincent Brown, weren't they? People were quite terrified of Vincent Brown.
Yeah, but they were glory days, because he was up there and he was standing on his feet and he was going after them.
Why do I think you can see this editorial process where candidates for election, wherever they may be, but you could say particularly in America, it's just softball the whole time. There's no hardball questions anymore.
Yeah. Well, it depends on the ideology. That's the key.
But I mean, if all things being equal, they will gravitate towards whatever Fox News or towards CNN, and whichever is going to give you a nice, easy interview. They're not going to ask you any difficult questions.
Yeah, but if you look at the Trump-Harris debates, you can see a really strong differential in the treatment between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's quite clear who the media want to succeed. I mean, that's utterly obvious to anybody, really. But the point really is that unless you're sort of viewed as anathema, you're sort of some kind of renegade, you're going to get sort of softball journalism. You're never going to be sort of interrogated. There was like that. Who was that guy? He used to work for the Times, I think, in London. Was it O'Neill? His last name? I forget his first name now. The former editor there. He used to be on a lot of TV programs, and people would shudder.
Andrew Neil, yes.
Andrew Neil. Yeah. He used to absolutely rake people over the coals earlier on in his career. And then towards the end, he softened up a bit, and now I guess he's gone out.
Yeah, and he was hammering the COVID drum as well, more loudly than most, actually.
Yeah, which is quite shocking. If you think about his early career, he was a real sort of lion, really. He'd just go for people's throats, and he wouldn't hit them, at all.
Well, that's right. I mean, and people like Jeremy Paxman, they were kind of like, formidable, warriors, as it were, in the democratic discussion. Now, maybe a lot of it was pantomime and Punch and Judy, but nevertheless, you got the sense that, and indeed overall, that sense was very strong, that if a politician made a very grievous error or committed some foul deed or whatever, maybe even personal stuff, there would be consequences in relation to his career, and that no longer obtains. The criteria are different. You have to then say, okay, but which side is he on? What's his view in general? Is he in harmony with the agenda, the narrative? And if he is, the chances are he won't be touched. They'll find a way out for him.
Can I ask you, do you think anyone will ever be held accountable for the rollout of the COVID vaccines and the subsequent health issues, either here or in any country? Do you think that will ever happen?
Well, I think I can't say any country. I mean, there are some signs of movements in various countries. In Australia, I saw where a senior, I think it was a premier of one of the provinces, said last week that mRNA had destroyed Australia. And so I think there will be, particular pockets of resistance and attempts to impose some form of justice. But overall, if you look at the situation that this is actually, what we're dealing with here, we're dealing with a situation where virtually on a monolithic basis, the establishments of the West are all on the same side. And that includes political establishments, judicial establishments, media establishments, scientific experience, medical, so on and so on, right? So, where's the arrests? Where are the arrests going to come from? Who is going to do the collar feeding? The police are, of course, in on it as well. They were as much up to their neck. They were made complicit. It's very interesting, when you think about it like this, that the police forces were made complicit in this crime. They were put out there dragging people off buses and, out of parks and beating people across the head for protesting and so on. And I wonder if that wasn't part of the thinking, that by making them complicit, it was ensured that they would not be the ones to do the collar feeding when the time came, because they might be arguably deemed as culpable as anybody.
Yeah, well, you see, that is one of the problems where, I think, am I right in believing that they've changed the kind of the oath that the Gardaí have to say when they become Templemore or whatever. You're supposed to be sort of an officer of the state, not of the government. Whereas now I think it's very much become you are a tool of the whatever government happens to be in power, rather than serving the state.
That goes to a much larger point as well, Luke, that they've redefined democracy to mean that. I mean, democracy used to mean the sovereignty of the people. And the people, that essentially the first principle of common law was, that the people do not have to do anything that they don't want to do, and the government can only do what the people permit them to do. That was the fundamental of common law. We're a long way from that now, and that's what's happened. They've redefined democracy as meaning the incumbent personnel and their interests. And anybody who challenges that, which is, in other words, anybody who mounts opposition, even, by definition, it's a tautology, but democratic opposition in this context, they become enemies of democracy. They become domestic terrorists. This is the trick they've pulled, or one of the tricks, one of the many tricks. And again, going back to our fictional, libertarian journalist on his plinth in some elevated. He is ignoring this also. He's good with this. This is the cost of all this, that these people have, it's almost as if that they don't any longer think of themselves as having any legacy to leave behind, or else they feel assured that their side is going to win, is going to dominate, and all history will be rewritten, and their role will be rewritten, as was the plan in the Soviet bloc.
Sounds very Orwellian to me, yeah.
Yeah. So that the truth will be, everything will, their actual words will be memory hold, as we know from Winston Smith's famous job in the Ministry of Truth, and they will be heroes, not just for one day, for the rest of their lives and thereafter.
Yeah. Well, I suppose with all these, I suppose you call it a rollout of a new regime. There's an element of carrot, and the carrot has to be offered in order to then to be apply the stick to the vast majority of us. But you need people who are going to be, the policemen of this system, of this agenda. I suppose that the Agenda 2030 rollout is sort of well in progress.
Yes.
What worries me is how how are we going to reach people to make them aware of what this actual agenda is? Because of course that you can go and find out what Agenda 2030 is. You can go and look up everything about all of this on the World Economic Forum. There's bits of it on the sort of World Health Organization websites, etc., etc. It's all there for anyone to find. But the trouble is, there's no desire amongst the vast majority of people to actually even find out what any of this is, or why it might be problematic.
Well, I think it's even worse than that, Luke, in the sense that an awful lot of people don't even know there's anything to be found out. It doesn't seem to occur to them that there's anything amiss whatsoever. This is an amazing thing I've discovered, even talking to people that I would really have expected to be aware at a deep level, maybe not entirely, on my page, as it were, but nevertheless, they haven't the faintest clue about the World Economic Forum and what it does. Not a clue. It doesn't. You see, we have to be conscious of the total blackout that has taken place, and the total nature of the corruption of communication, and for that reason, it's there are little signs of consciousness raising in different areas, but it's marginal enough. It's not anywhere near mainstream, and most people in the mainstream have no clue, and they're still in thrall to the idea that anybody who raises certain questions is a conspiracy theorist, which is of course a trope invented by the CIA precisely to block people off from thinking about certain things. And that's something that I think we're going to have to find a way around. The only way I can think of going around that, we have to concentrate on, the alternative media, do what you're doing. This is the answer ultimately. As we were saying, the media has basically disqualified. The mainstream media has more or less disqualified itself. It had done for some time, even before this happened. It was utterly, appalling already. But now I think it's there for the taking, and I just think that the alternative media needs to become a lot more organized, a lot more kind of clear in its tactic, in its strategy, and maybe a little bit more uniform. I don't want it to be totally uniform. It's a bit more uniform in its kind of, so that it covers all the bases, as it were. In telling people what's going down. I mean, there has been talk in the last couple of years about setting up an alternative channel that would somehow rival things like RTE. I'm sure that's possible, but you need somebody with deep pockets to back it. But there must be such people. But there must be such people. It's just that, in my experience, they don't really have the inclination to support even things they agree with. I found that with people, money people tend not to want to support. They don't like to give their money away anyway, but much less so than poor people. Like, poor people give you their money for things like.
Well, that makes sense to me in a way, because you think if you have nothing to lose, then you have no reason not to do something. If you feel that you have a lot to lose, you have your possessions, your wealth, your position in society, then the inclination to take risks is probably a lot less. If you're already sort of disenfranchised, what more have you got to lose anyway? So you might as well.
Well, that's right. That's right. And remember again that we are dealing with a monolith. They are dealing with a monolith. That the entire society, it isn't as if like there's just that part over there that is corrupted. Everything is corrupted, pretty much. And therefore they have to be conscious that they're dealing with something which is kind of, unassailable by any individual, even a very rich individual. And so they make the pragmatic decision to stay out of it. and to keep their heads down. I know that about certain people in a different context, in relation to other issues over the years, where people who would express profound, views in relation to certain issues privately, they would never put their money where their mouth was, ever, in relation to...
I've seen that myself, yeah.
And that's a big problem. I mean, and I've been, on the periphery of discussions over the years, for many years actually, going back when I was in the mainstream, of people proposing alternative newspapers, because there was a very strong sense in Ireland from about the mid-90s onwards, after the collapse of the Irish Press Group, that something needed to be done about the monolith of the independent newspapers and the monopoly that they had virtually. And in the Irish Times being just a token kind of, alternative, but not as powerful anything like it. And that these newspapers had a huge influence also on RTE, on the way that it saw the world and the way it treated the world, or treated of the world. And people would get together and there would be cabals or, various groups, consortiums and all this sort of stuff would come. And quite a few times I was approached to see would I become involved in one way or another, as a journalist, as an editor, or whatever. And I generally would say, well, I'm interested. It's definitely something that needs to happen. But, come back when you've got your act together, financially and so on. And you would hear little rumblings for a few months and then it would just dissolve and disappear. And that's happened.
I think there's a big problem with funding, largely due to such matters as advertising. I mean, look at RTE. I mean, RTE is the worst whore imaginable. You see, I don't really watch it, but I mean, I remember watching some daytime TV one time, and I can't remember what it was, the Today Show or something like that, and it was just basically, an advertorial for the, RTE's big advertisers, buying time slots. It was just absolutely disgraceful. It had no integrity whatsoever, and they just whore themselves out to whoever's going to offer the most money. And I think that's a problem in a small country where you've got limited avenues for getting to the public and making revenue through advertising, etc. It doesn't have this sort of a huge scale of readerships that you might say get in somewhere like America or even in comparison to the UK. So
that's right.
It's very difficult to fund anything,
Yes, and also and that was a factor related to that over the years RTE was boxing way above its weight in terms of remuneration for its so-called stars. Whereas this was a small country and small population and shouldn't be seen to be necessarily trying to compete with the BBC, but that's what they were doing, even though the BBC was the biggest media corporation at the time in the world, pretty much. And we were kind of in this situation where we had to pay, supposedly, our stars, the same as they would have got in Britain. And that was, the start of a particular trend where we really lost the run of ourselves in that context, as in many others. But the fundamental thing in my experience, and I've been involved in media, and I was on the Broadcasting Authority for a number of years, and its predecessor, the Broadcasting Commission. And that was something I was constantly aware of, like that. In all of discussions about media, the priorities were always political, or financial. They were never related to, democracy, freedom, culture. They were always defined by power and by the purse strings and by how these mechanisms would be used to the benefit of certain interests.
One can well believe that, but I'm afraid we've run out of time now. So I'm really sorry to cut you, but
maybe just because I think I've almost disappeared.
Wrap this up.
Luke.
So
I've almost disappeared.
You're still there, but yes, it is getting darker. But
I want
to say thank you so much for coming on, and that really was a very insightful and interesting interview. And Thank you so
Thank
much
you, Luke.
for taking the time to come on.
It's a pleasure. It was a pleasure, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I'll see you again sometime, I hope.
Okay. Thanks a million. Take care.